That's great. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Hopefully, that covered everyone. And we're here to the first of the first in the series of webinars we will have around on CGIAR Road from COP29 to COP30. And we'll be starting with Article 6.8, which covers non-market approaches under the Paris Agreement. But before we proceed, I would like to turn over to um, to, Daniela to talk more about the webinar series. Daniela?
Yes, hello everyone. Welcome to our first of 5 series of webinars from COP29 to COP30. Just as information, this is our first webinar. And the next one is on NCQG, mid-March. We're planning on the 13th of March. And the third one on GGA by the end of March, hopefully on the 27th. After that, on loss and damage and trust transition in April. You're all welcome to follow our channels to be informed about the upcoming webinars and the specific dates. But now I give the floor back to Eliza Villarino, our moderator for today. And enjoy the webinar and be aware that you can use the Q&A for your questions.
Thanks, Daniela. So today we're going to talk about a topic that I've been passionate about for the last 2 years, and that started because I thought my research pretty much aligned with this, and it started when I had a conversation with Stephen Leonard, one of our speakers here. We were talking about I don't know, and I just asked him what it is all about, and it got me into thinking that yeah, we could engage in that space, and I think CGR can contribute so much more. And so Steve is probably the one of the most well-versed, probably the person that I know most well-versed on UNFCCC and the processes there, and especially Article 6.8. So he has been so instrumental in getting CGIAR into that space because he helped us within Mitigate Plus, the CGIAR initiative on low emission food systems, to make submissions through the support of the CGIAR impact platform, climate impact platform, on Article 6.8. So Steve, later we will be speaking with him about some of the advancements that have been happening within the Article 6.8 space. And of course, everyone will be talking about what will come up next this year and moving forward. But of course, it's so important for me, as somebody who's kind of new in this new kid on the block, to understand the history. And I did some reading last night about it, but I think it will be important to learn so much more about some of the dynamics that happened then, which was like more than 10 years ago. By the way, I believe this is the 10th year, a decade after the Paris Agreement. So it's great that we're implementing some of them, including Article 6.8. So the guy who'll be doing that with me would be Peter Weeks, who is the director of Pivot Point. He's also part of Clara, the coordinator of the International Network, Climate, Land, Ambition, and Rights Alliance. I know his colleague Suparna, and they've been so engaged in this space. I think they're probably the observer organization that knows most about it. And it would be great to learn from him about Article 6.8, how it all began, and also for him to give his take on what might happen next, especially this year and moving forward. And finally, the person who's sort of instrumental for having the first NMA registered on the UNFCCC platform, and he's with the African Development Bank, and the person who has sort of seen through the registration of the adaptation benefits mechanism. And from what I learned, it's been in the works, one of the pilot projects for NMAs. And it's actually a very interesting mechanism, and I don't want to say anything because I might misinterpret it, but it will be great to learn how it has come about, what's gonna happen next after it's been registered, which is just, I don't know, a few months ago. So, but it would be great because I think it's a first mechanism that really tackles adaptation, no? So that really more from the investment point of view, from what I understand. And that's Garrett Phillips. He's the manager for the Climate and Environment Finance Division. But first, I would love to speak to Peter about you know how it all came about. Why is it so important that Article 6.8 was there? And of course, like I said, I've just been engaging in this space for the last 2 years now, my third year. So Peter, can you tell us more about it? And it's for me, everything that the origin story is always nice to hear. So I'd love to hear from you. Why 6.8 needs to be there in the Paris Agreement.
Sure. Thank you very much, Liza. Thank you to you and Daniela and Vanessa and Gina and everybody who has put together this webinar. And let me also congratulate you and thank you that you are focusing first on the thing that matters most, which are the non-market approaches to climate finance. Now, it's interesting to think about this non-market approach and where it came from, because it actually came from a history of international cooperation within the UNFCCC that really focused on bringing down the cost of mitigation, the unit cost of mitigation. And it started with a couple of programs, JI, you may remember, Joint Implementation, as well as the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism. These were market-based, but mostly trading and transaction-based mechanisms for international cooperation on mitigation action that moved ahead and provided some of the context and thinking for this in the run-up to the Paris Agreement for a mechanism that would focus on international cooperation for mitigation action. Building on those precedents, when folks got into the Paris Agreement negotiations, I think we can say there was some discomfort with the fact that a mechanism for international cooperation, the conversation around it really became almost entirely about carbon markets. And several of the developing country were concerned about this, felt that international cooperation needed to reflect that broader universe of possibility for cooperation, the elements of the solidarity economy, as well as opportunity to take on some of the issues which perhaps don't lend themselves as well to a market-based solution. I'm just quickly looking at the chat, make sure everything's okay. Y'all can hear me fine, yeah?
Yes, we can hear you.
So this is going on within the Article 6 discussion. Almost all of the negotiating time has been given over to market mechanisms, and some of the countries that were concerned about that put forward first a paper that pertained to joint mitigation adaptation and said, well, we need kind of more holistic solutions, and we're looking for a way within 6.8 for that to happen. I think the original document on joint mitigation adaptation came out from the government of Bolivia, but certainly had other supporters in that. And I would defer to Stephen Leonard, who is a lawyer, and I am not, and therefore knows perhaps more about the actual nitty-gritty of the negotiations that went on in that time. Let me shift and say, at that same time, 2015, 10 years ago, groups that were involved with land rights and indigenous rights, groups that were involved with agroecology, as well as the big conservation groups who were involved in forest conservation, both conservation and avoided deforestation. Those groups had sort of their own lobbying spheres and own areas of activity, but we hadn't gotten together, and that was kind of the point that eventually led to the formation of CLARA, the Climate, Land, Ambition and Rights Alliance. And each of the words in that acronym matter.
Yeah.
Ambition and rights matter a lot. And what we found was the issues that we were most concerned about naturally fit into the 6.8 framework. What we found, and this is basically taking 10 years of discussion and negotiating history and compressing it into 2 minutes. But we found a couple areas in which we felt Article 6.8 on our market mechanisms was better suited than other mechanisms for to support certain kinds of activities. We saw good links to biodiversity conservation, and we should come back to that. We saw the use, and this is very important, we saw the use of the word holistic that came up in the 6.8 mechanism that was not found in 6.2 or 6.4 mechanisms, which are primarily carbon revenue denominated. Ultimately, we saw language on Mother Earth-centered solutions, and what we saw there essentially was the one place within the climate finance architecture that was taking not just indigenous rights seriously, but the potential to take indigenous worldviews seriously and see those worldviews reflected in a funding mechanism that embraced holism, that didn't separate out mitigation and adaptation, was community-based, but could also scale. We saw types of finance that could be linked to land tenure reform, to agroecology, and to certain forms of just transition. We knew that some of the big companies were talking about, quote, beyond value chain mitigation. That is, they weren't looking to do carbon trading, but they were very interested in supporting international mitigation action. This also seemed to be the appropriate place for those kinds of activities to move forward. And then potentially, and this come up most recently at COP29, there's a potential link in Article 6.8 to the broader adaptation goal, again through JMA, the Joint Mitigation Adaptation Approach. I think it's also fair to say that 6.8 has struggled for airtime, if you will. That has been much better in the last couple of years. There's been a more balanced discussion within the UNFCCC, but there's also still some complexities associated with the platform. We very much appreciate that the 6.8 platform has been launched. Others will talk about that. So I think I will leave it there and let my esteemed fellow panelists pick up that thread. So thank you, Eliza, and looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think it is great because you also mentioned Steve. He might know more of the nitty-gritty of the details or the details on that. So maybe Steve, you could come in, maybe follow up with that and then get into where we are right now. What are the advancements so far? Are you happy?
Not sure I'm ever happy at the UNFCCC, to be honest, but I think I have a lot of company there on that as well. But what else is there? Yeah, I guess just picking up on where Peter had sort of touched on in terms of some of the history. I mean, my interest in the work on Article 6.8 has been mostly the way that it has evolved in the context of the REDD+ negotiations, with the extent of emphasis that REDD+ obviously has on market-based approaches, this joint mitigation, adaptation, synergistic approach that didn't involve carbon trading came through as a part of sort of as an alternative approach that countries could take that didn't necessarily want to or couldn't for constitutional reasons, as is the case in some countries, and or that were reflecting different worldviews that didn't align with the commodification of nature and maybe had challenges with carbon rights. And so it's evolved over time as this sort of parallel approach, which has been very courageously and persistently led by representatives from the government of Bolivia, with building support over that time. And so it found its way into the Paris Agreement in Article 6, and since then, and obviously was everything along the line, everything else delayed with the pandemic, and was then really properly launched with the establishment of what they call the Glasgow Committee at the COP in Glasgow in 2021. And so since the Glasgow Committee has come into place, they've been essentially having a series of roundtable discussions, spin-off groups, technical discussions to really try to unpack what it is that the mechanism will look like. They've got this web platform which has gone through a series of sort of machinations as to whether or not it's a matchmaking platform or whether or not it's not a matchmaking platform and what it is. And they have this web-based platform that's been set up, which comes along with a whole bunch of sort of technical sort of a framework that I think is at times maybe perhaps a little more technical than maybe it needs to be. But Gareth, I think, can probably make some comments on this as someone who has been through this and submitted a proposal. Or submitted had a project uploaded and accepted in the platform. I don't think it's so much submitting proposals. And so it's in terms of where we are now in Azerbaijan at COP29, there was essentially a sort of a step back and have a look at how things have been going with the implementation and the completion of what they're calling sort of the stage or phase 1, and now moving into phase 2. But what we've been focusing on, Eliza, in the work that I've been working with you on, is really trying to think about the implementation of this and how there can be support for implementation, both in terms of financial support and capacity development support. Because if you start working through the framework and the different COP decisions that have come out over the years, there's a lot there that a national focal point really needs to be able to do. And so just for some who might be interested, and maybe Eliza or colleagues can share links to the submissions pages on some of this, but we've been really thinking about what a readiness type of mechanism for the implementation of Article 6.8 non-market approaches might look like at the national level, and not so much the frameworks at the international level. Eliza and I have focused a lot on this, and we're sort of hoping that maybe the Standing Committee on Finance might pick this up in their discussions, because we think it's important enough, and they haven't really looked at non-markets to date. And so it'd be good if the Standing Committee on Finance would do it, but also the financial mechanisms of the UNFCCC. So the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the Global Environment Facility. It would be great to see readiness programs or support programs being put in place to be providing support for national focal points to be working with partners. And also for potential project participants and proponents, and may even also be funded. But so 6.8 at the moment, and as we go into Belém at the COP30 in Brazil, it's at a bit of a crossroads in that there's sort of some questions that have come up around the accessibility and the uptake. And so there's a submissions process that's underway at the moment, essentially seeking submissions on sort of barriers and solutions for utilizing the platform. And this has largely come out of the fact that there haven't been many. There's one that's currently published, which Gareth will speak to, has been involved in, which is the adaptation benefits mechanism, and then there's this other one that I understand is in the pipeline and making its way through. Yeah. So there's a lot of discussion about what are the barriers and the challenges to moving forward with this, and just to maybe identify, I think a couple of the barriers that I think are important to think through. One is there is quite a significant technical burden that flows through in terms of expectations for national focal points, and just sort of picking up. And Gareth, it'd be interesting to hear what you say about this and who did the work. I'm trying to get into the campfire chat vibe and sort of trying to sort of engage, open up a discussion with the other participants a little bit. But it'd be good to hear a little bit about these areas of technical expertise that national focal points are expected to have. And maybe I'll just go through a quick list. There's understanding of synergistic mitigation, adaptation approaches. That in and of itself is very technical, and there are very few people that would understand what that would even look like. And then there's the it should involve mitigation as well in a lot of circumstances. It doesn't necessarily have to, but there's the quantification of greenhouse gas emissions is another very technical area of expertise. Compliance or alignment with the 11th preambular paragraph of the Paris Agreement. So this is in the human rights space. So again, another very technical area of work. Looking at ensuring, so building the rationale and the justification to show that the initiative doesn't involve the transfer of any mitigation outcomes. Again, quite technical. Participation of stakeholders. There's a requirement there for the full and effective participation of stakeholders. Again, quite challenging. And so these go on and on, including support for national institutions and strengthening institutional governance frameworks, and opportunities for coordination across instruments and relevant institutional arrangements. And so anyone who's going through the process of uploading one of these initiatives to the system have to answer questions on all these items. And if you look at the platform as well, you can see the way that this is all sort of unpacked with all of the answers, and the ABM that's there is a pioneer on this. And so this sort of technical capacity is an area where I think that organizations like the CGIAR can really provide some quality assistance to countries in the global south. These need to be country to country or government to government type of arrangements, and you need at least two governments to agree and to be on board with moving something forward within the platform, which I will raise as the second barrier. My view is that this is a very narrow interpretation of what international cooperation means. And given that Article 6 is all about international cooperation, to have Article 6.8 only limited to government arrangements, in my view, is too narrow. It limits the potential for the mechanism in and of itself. And if we look at recent developments under the global stocktake, you could also potentially argue that it undermines the outcome of the first global stocktake, which has its own section dedicated to what international cooperation means. And most of that section is about engagement with stakeholders. And so when we think about what international cooperation currently is within the context of 6.8, we have challenges with the uptake of the initiative. We have one, maybe two 6.8 NMAs that are coming through, and the potential of Article 6.8, if it were to be a more open space with joint initiatives with stakeholders and having broader access for stakeholders to the platform, then that's something that could really be taken up in a much larger way, and then build joint efforts and collaborations between stakeholders and governments to be implementing NDCs, which is essentially also very much what 6.8 is about. And so with that, I'll maybe just finish up, and maybe we can hear from Gareth, because I'm very much looking forward to hearing about your experience with the platform, and whether or not you agree or disagree with some of the things that you've heard from Peter and myself, and also look forward to any questions and discussion with the participants here. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. And yeah, I think you set it up very well for Gareth to speak about their experience. And I, for one, is very interested. I'm very interested about what their experiences are and what would be his tips to anyone who will be trying this out as well. So Gareth, the floor is yours. Tell us your experience.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, look, I mean, we came up with the idea of the adaptation benefits mechanism back in 2016. So this was a long time ago that the idea came up, and it was really stimulated from a request from the UN Secretariat to participate in a webinar or a conference where we talked about what we could do with the CDM infrastructure, with the all of the experience and skills that we had there, and that was where I initially proposed using the CDM project cycle to quantify adaptation benefits. But interestingly, it was too innovative for the UN Secretariat, and they didn't like my slides, so they asked me to tone it down and talk about something else. So I didn't get a chance to present it at that conference. But we then the first place that it was then written up and proposed was as in response to a call for inputs at SB45, I think in October, November 2016. So that's where the first reference to the adaptation benefits mechanism and the creation of adaptation benefits first arises. And then, I mean, we had quite a long period of trying to find some funding for pilot projects and work out a little bit about what it was and so on. And then we finally launched our pilot phase in 2019. And the project cycle very much mirrors that of the clean development mechanism. And the reason for that was that although there were problems with the clean development mechanism, and there were lots of reasons why it collapsed, but that was not due to the project cycle. During the 10 years of really strong operation of the CDM, they processed 12,000 projects, over 8,000 of which were registered, which is an extremely substantial pipeline compared to, for example, the Green Climate Fund, where after 10 years they're on project 250. So this is because of this process of outsourcing the validation, the verification, and avoiding at least that particular bottleneck of having a secretariat and so on. So we built on that project cycle, and we created our own executive committee instead of an executive board, and so on. So the whole sort of project cycle behind it, very similar, very familiar to anybody who's worked in the CDM or joint implementation, carbon market, voluntary carbon market space, and so on. But it has this very important difference in that we don't create this fungible commodity, and that creates a fundamental difference. What happened, at least my understanding from the Clean Development Mechanism, was that in the end, Clean Development Mechanism projects were financed by investment banks who offered money for the projects but took the credits at a relatively low price, aggregated them, and then sold them off for a significant profit in the market. And I know about that because I worked for a private sector company that tried to do that during the CDM days. In the end, that's what contributed to the uneven playing field, because the private sector went to where it was cheapest, because that's how you maximized your profit against a benchmark price. And at the same time, there was this this chorus in the background about commoditization of Mother Earth coming from Bolivia, as Peter and Stephen have indicated. And really, I think in the end, it was that message from Bolivia that really, for me at least, started to resonate, because I realized that we were not delivering the cheapest form of meeting the targets, because that was being sucked up by profit by the investment banks. And then under the Paris Agreement, the concept of selling mitigation outcomes when you have your own target, it's a contradiction. The Kyoto Protocol, the Clean Development Mechanism and the Kyoto Protocol, its strength was that developing countries didn't have targets, but we know that the Kyoto Protocol ultimately failed because developing countries didn't have targets. So the Paris Agreement had everybody taking on a target, and consequently the idea of trading mitigation outcomes is flawed. There was a window, whilst the NDCs didn't cover the full economy, but even now, as we move towards ambitious NDCs, that window is closing. We've lost 10 years when we could have been trading mitigation outcomes, and I think now that's gone. And that's why it's so important that now we work on on a non-market approach. There's a number of other interesting factors. We don't really have time to get into it, but what we see, particularly, and the reason why we focused so much on adaptation, was that most adaptation projects don't have a cash flow associated with them. They deliver public goods, not cash flows or revenues. And I'm still amazed. People talk in the same breath about debt, green bonds, concessional finance, and adaptation. But if you don't have a cash flow, you can't access any of those. If you've got no money to pay back a loan, then you can't borrow money from anybody. And that's the fundamental reason why adaptation projects don't get any finance. They only live off grant funding, and we know there's not enough grant funding around. So the idea with the adaptation benefits mechanism, just like the Clean Development Mechanism did for renewable energy, is we provide a new source of cash flow through the sale of certified adaptation benefits that enables the project developer to go to the capital markets and borrow money to build their project. And the sort of one of the interesting differences about the non-market approach is that instead of a profit-driven model, as you saw in the carbon markets, we have what we describe as a minimum concessionality model. We look at the project and we say, how much money do you need to plug the financial gap? And we will seek to get that money for you as a combination of the number of adaptation benefits times the price. So if you need $1 million and, because of the definition of adaptation benefits, you're going to deliver 100,000 of them, then each adaptation benefit is valued at $10. And you'll generate 100,000, sell them for $10, you get your $1 million to plug your financial gap, and then that's it. No more money after that. So you just use enough money to make the project viable. And we like to say that we help the project developers make a living, not a killing. And so that's a much more efficient use of climate finance. And I mean, in the current landscape now, this is becoming increasingly relevant to find ways to be efficient in how we use that money. Now, let's come to the registration process. And I have a secret weapon as to how I did that. I have a consultant called Lucy. She's not on the call, but she worked in the UNFCCC and she speaks that language. So that list of technical requirements for the national focal points that Stephen referred to, she can answer all those questions. So actually, I didn't fill in any of the forms for registering the ABM on the platform. She did all that. And then she gave it to Bob Natafu, who was the climate change coordinator in Uganda, and he pasted them all into the website. It did take some time. I think there was some toing and froing, but she provided all that input to answer those questions and clearly satisfied all the requirements. So I would say that to get over this understanding of the technical burden for the national focal points and registering it, you need to speak the UNFCCC language. You've got to understand what these questions mean and how to provide a suitable answer. And I think if CGIAR is looking to provide support, I think that would be a great way of building capacity within these institutions to help them register. The other thing is that it is a cooperative approach, and this was when we went to the end session workshop at COP29. I think there were 7 or 8 other non-market approaches that were presented there. Almost all of them were unilateral. And if they're just unilateral, then despite I take Stephen's point about being a very narrow definition of cooperative approaches, but in UN terms, then if you're just one country, then it can't be cooperative. Just to note that the adaptation benefits mechanism, it was supported by, I think, 8 or 9 African countries. So we didn't have an Annex 1. They were all non-Annex 1 countries. But it is an instrument that is designed for business to business, for private sector to private sector transaction, not expected to be a government to government. There is a requirement for a host country letter of approval or authorization to say that this project contributes to our adaptation needs and to acknowledge. And that's important because it means that the buying country can then gain access to the enhanced transparency framework to report their contribution, to report money that's been spent as a contribution towards adaptation needs, or it could be technical capacity or technology or capacity building as well. It doesn't have to be money, so that letter of approval is important. But ours is not a government-to-government instrument. It can be, but it's primarily aimed private sector to private sector, and that's because our goal is really to have developed countries and countries that can afford it to require entities that emit greenhouse gases to the atmosphere to pay an adaptation tax. So, our chief pitch is for participants in the UK and the EU emissions trading scheme. For every ton of CO2 that they report under the ETS, they should be spending 10 euros on purchasing adaptation benefits in order to contribute to the costs of adaptation associated with the greenhouse gases that they emit. Because that's the fundamental problem. Nobody is paying for adaptation. There's lots of initiatives mobilizing money through mitigation, but no government is requiring anybody to contribute towards the cost of adaptation. It's left to the voluntary sector, and that's just, it's not doing enough. Let me stop there, and I kind of lost track of time, but
but Gareth, you mentioned something interesting, because I think it depends on who will invest, right? So what have you done something, and because I'm asking for the next steps, have you done something to sort of reach out or talk with, these governments so that they are aware they could make this investment?
We are speaking frequently, and I spoke with one government today. I had actually a very positive meeting, which I hope might might result in some progress. I mean, especially in the very current landscape for ODA finance, where we think that's going to be falling, then it's extremely relevant if governments could find new ways of mobilizing money for, well, adaptation, development work, and so on. And so, the adaptation benefits mechanism fits very well into that scope. I mean, quite literally, with a stroke of a pen, a government in the UK or Europe could create a requirement for emitters to contribute to the cost of adaptation. So, the timing in that sense now could be quite ripe for a proposal to be brought forward at COP30 and say, this is what we're going to do. The current state of our pilot phase is we're now trying to create what we call the African Adaptation Benefit Fund. And this is a fund that would sign purchase agreements for adaptation benefits. And when you've got a registered project and a purchase agreement with a creditworthy offtaker, you can go to a financial institution and borrow money. So that's the situation we want to get to. And the African Adaptation Benefit Fund is a replicate of the World Bank Prototype Carbon Fund. So anybody who was in the CDM in 2000 will remember that the World Bank set up this Prototype Carbon Fund, and they signed the first contracts for the purchase of certified emission reductions under the CDM, and they kickstarted that process. We want to repeat that for the adaptation benefits mechanism. So we're looking for donors, foundations, philanthropies, and so on to come in and provide some, 10, 20, $30 million. And we will have a call for proposals that will say to project developers, we have $1 million of cash flow. What kind of adaptation benefits can you give us for that money? And
that's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was listening into the technical dialogue on NCQG, and there was some private sector. And the question for them, we'd love to get involved, but what is it for us? I mean, you need to make that argument. So have you spoken with these governments about how they're going to make this argument because of course they are aware of mitigation, right? Reduction, but how about adaptation? Are they
Governments just need to regulate. I mean, the NCQG calls on governments to create enabling environments. And, we tend to think it's developing country governments, but in this case, it's developed country governments that need to step up and say, we are going to regulate on adaptation. And, they regulated on mitigation. I mean, you may not remember it, but there was a time when, voluntary emission reduction didn't exist. It was worth nothing. The whole reason why there's a carbon market is because governments regulated. So all it takes is governments to regulate for adaptation. Now, I don't think they've done it yet because they haven't had a mechanism that would allow them to implement that mechanism, like a flexibility mechanism that would enable the participants to meet the targets. But that's effectively what the adaptation benefits mechanism is. It's a flexibility mechanism that would allow developed country governments to regulate for adaptation, and it would give the regulated entities a means through which they could meet that target.
That's great. No, it's interesting, and I would love to learn more because it seemed like, for example, you said they could go into the capital market. Who would have to take out this loan? Because, of course, I've been listening to the discussions. It's kind of sensitive, the word loan, when you talk about non-market approaches and things like that. So how did you go about that?
The African Development Bank would want to lend to the project developers who have a registered project and a purchase agreement. So we don't want to be doing this forever. We're setting the secretariat up, we're piloting it, and we want to hand it off so that we can get on with lending money because we're a bank and that's what we do. We can arrange guarantees. The GCF and Swedish IDA have both indicated interest in guarantees to support loans to adaptation projects. And again, now we're getting into the details because this is I mentioned this minimum concessionality financing model based on the financing gap. It means you can put all the transaction costs into that cash flow. So if you have to pay for a guarantee and you've got interest for borrowing the money along with the methodology development and the activity, all those are genuine or eligible costs that go into the financial model that need to be paid for through the price. So ultimately, the buyer pays the cost of the financing and the guarantee and so on, but all of that is required to enable the system to work. And these are some of the benefits that we get from moving away from a market-based approach where you're just reducing your profit if you do any of these kinds of things. And so, that's why you end up only with limited kinds of projects coming forward.
Okay.
And In terms of handing it off, look, our dream outcome is that the UN Secretariat would say, okay, we will run the Secretariat in parallel to the Article 6.4 Supervisory Committee. We'll put another Secretariat in to run Article 6.8 ABM. That would be our dream outcome. The next scenario is that a global NGO like, I don't know, WRI or TNC or somebody says, okay, we'll take it on and run it for the global good. And so the third scenario, which is sort of the least favorite, would be that each of the MDBs takes it on for their own, the multilateral development banks takes it on for their own constituencies and runs it for their region in their language with their adaptation problems. But that would then sort of conflict with our desire to lend. But there are a number of sort of exit strategies that could see this moving forward and becoming available to everybody. And actually, it's highly relevant for developed countries as well. It's not just for developing countries because adaptation costs need to be funded everywhere.
Yeah, that's great. Before I go to the question, I'd like to hear from Steve and Peter about what you've heard from Garrett, because it's interesting. And that's, I mean, for Peter, coming from Clario, how does, because like I said, it sounds very much like a little, I mean, you're not making a profit from this mechanism, right? And that's what's you're saying difference from what we've seen so far. So Peter, what do you think about ABM from what you know about non-market approaches? I mean, they met of course, because you said you have a consultant, and actually I would love to hear from Steve, because Steve very much knows about the UNFCCC language, and I want to know how many actually have that capacity to actually support in the process of registering for the non-market approach.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
look, I mean, it's really interesting to hear more about the adaptation benefits mechanism, and I think what you were alluding to there, is Eliza, is the way that it does fly very close to a type of transactional sort of trading type of mechanism, and so I would imagine that there would be perhaps some within the context of the work under Article 6.8 that may have things to say, but I'm not going to sort of get into that. But I think that the point about the potential role for the CGIAR here, I think, is really what's an important part that's coming out of the conversation, and this role that I think organizations such as the CG and different organizations within the consortium can play in terms of supporting countries and sort of project developers to be understanding the different criteria that need to be met in order to be moving something like this forward, I think is really where it's at. And not everybody has a I don't recall the consultant's name, but Lucy, I think, was it? Not everybody has a Lucy, But so that, I think, raises some of the major. Are the Lucy's going to be very busy potentially in the future, or there should be a lot of work that gets undertaken for at the national level with governments, because working through these sorts of things is really important. One other thing that I just wanted to clarify there, Gareth, that I'd mentioned is in terms of the I guess broadening of the space. I wasn't suggesting sort of any unilateral approaches. What I was suggesting there is more of a space for community-based initiatives, philanthropic funders, a space for non-governments to be able to highlight the initiatives that they're looking at developing, and sort of creating almost not. I mean, if the countries don't want to go down the trajectory of actual matchmaking, at least creating a platform so that there's an opportunity there for initiatives to be able to showcase and to publish what it is that they're doing, because no foundation is aware of every initiative that's being developed out in the world, and the relationships often don't exist. And so using Article 6.8 for providing that sort of a platform, to be able to showcase the different potential initiatives that are coming forward, because as we all know, a lot of work often goes into a lot of really great project development, but because people feel a lot of the fatigue in terms of trying to raise funds, there's a lot of good projects just simply don't get off the ground, and so Article 6.8 could potentially provide a useful role there, and then have a sort of a second tier there, which involves the government endorsement, so to speak, of the initiative, which happens a lot at the national level through national legal frameworks for projects that are being implemented in any case. So that's the sort of thing that I think would really add a lot of value to the 6.8 platform. And one of the other things that I just wanted to highlight in terms of the CGIAR and the work on food systems, that I think the Article 6.8 is very much lends itself to projects that are in that food system space and in that agriculture space. There's a lot that's taking place on forests. There's the carbon markets work. We have now this really interesting new initiative that Brazil are moving forward called the Tropical Forest Finance Facility, which is also sort of a non-market type of initiative, even though it would be investing in the stock market. So I don't know whether or not that means it's a market initiative or not, but it's being it's sort of, I think, more in that non-market space. But when it comes to agriculture, there's I think that non-market based approach, carbon markets in agriculture is not something that has really gained much traction for a lot of reasons. Forest carbon is struggling in and of itself. And so sort of dependence on market-based or carbon market-based approaches for agriculture is something that I think is very, very challenging. And also the discussions on agriculture within the context of the UNFCCC have been very focused on the adaptation side of the coin, very much reluctant to be getting into the mitigation side of things. But food systems approaches, which do very much bring in that mitigation, adaptation, synergistic side of things for agriculture, are really right in the sort of sweet spot when it comes to the types of initiatives that Article 6.8 is likely to sort of provide a platform for. So, the work that CG is doing around food systems, I think, is something to really continue to explore with partners in countries, and how the CG can support the work towards engagement with 6.8.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, but maybe Peter, would you like to say something about what Garrett? I mean, this is the first, so maybe
Sure.
And then we'll get to the question that we have from our one of the participants. Go ahead.
Great. Well, let's leave time for questions, but let me make two quick points. First is non-market does not mean that there aren't incentives. Incentive structures are built into non-market approaches. There are opportunities to pursue capital stacking, and some of the most effective holistic approaches recognize that they might have a market component, but they'll also have capital stacks where investors will, or stakeholders are comfortable receiving less than market returns. We're seeing in the Red Plus and some of the Brazilian proposals the use of performance-based mechanisms, so ex post payments, which is different than crediting. Agree with Gareth that with all countries having targets, it brings into question this market trading approach. But also to note that NDCs will continue to have conditional portions, which are essentially wish lists by countries for what things they could take on. Second point, which sort of turns your question around, Eliza, which is, where does innovative finance go? Innovative finance involves a much broader universe of actions than are true in commodity-based, commodity-denominated approaches. Innovative finance really needs to find its way into spaces like agroecology and whatnot. And I think one of the most significant, and I'll close with this, one of the most significant presentations that was given in one of the 6.8 workshops was by a colleague of mine, or former colleague, from the Ford Foundation, because governments, I think, had not really thought about the universe of innovative finance or, non-governmental finance, philanthropies, faith networks, and what have you. And there was this, everybody in the room sort of sat up straight and said, oh, right, there's a whole other universe of potential partners, of potential funding sources that come with very different expectations, but are very suited to the holistic goals of Article 6.8. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Very great, great points. So there's this question for Garrett, no? Really interesting intervention, Garrett, especially under the recent ODA cuts. Any examples in Africa of countries which have developed regulatory frameworks around adaptation, which could serve as a reference? This is from Sana Monse. Sorry for mispronouncing your name, but Garrett. Are you on mute, Garrett?
Okay, yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not particularly aware of countries, of any African countries that have developed a regulatory framework around adaptation. I mean, we have a number of countries that have created climate change acts, and they have climate change commissions and so on. And but as far as I'm aware, they're largely tending to focus on mitigation, because that's where a lot of the push has been, particularly around engagement in Article 6.2 and 6.4. I think maybe it was Peter that said in his introduction that they've sucked up a lot of the airtime, and it's been very difficult to get any attention to focus on adaptation and 6.8. So I think most of the work has been done around the carbon markets, and actually continues to be so. I mean, it's interesting how often you attend an event on Article 6, and after a cursory acknowledgement of Article 6.8, the rest of the 55 minutes of the event is spent talking about mitigation. So we still have a lot of work to do to really demonstrate the full potential around Article 6.8. And I think that it will always be difficult to regulate in that space, because or to create a regulatory framework, because adaptation is so diverse, it's so diffuse, it's so difficult to find. I mean, you couldn't, unlike mitigation, where you have such clear methodologies and technology and solutions and so on, where it's relatively easy to create a regulatory framework. Adaptation, I think, is much harder. I think we do see links between adaptation and things like disaster risk preparedness. And I think it will be very important to create better frameworks around reporting the finance spent on these activities, because I think it's important that developing countries are able to show how much money they spend on their own adaptation to climate change, in order to continue to make the case for further support from developed countries or wealthy countries. But I think that those are, I think there's a lot of work to be done there. Just to come to I think it was Stephen said about the transactional nature, and as Peter said, there's nothing against making a profit or and so on. With the adaptation benefit mechanism, it's very clear that we create benefits that go into a register, and the only thing you can do with that is redeem the benefit. And when you redeem it, then you will get a unique certificate that says, this is how much money I paid that went to the project developer. These were the inputs and these were the outputs. And so, you could sell the redemption code, but there's no reason why anybody would pay you anything other than just a retail markup on the redemption code. Because when you get the certificate, even if your adaptation benefits, the underlying contribution to the project is $100, and you buy it for $130, the certificate that you get will say $100. You won't get credit for the $30 that you paid as the retail markup. You'll only get credit for the $100 that you paid to the project developer. So in that sense, it's a non-transactional instrument, in that there's no transfer of a credit from one register to another. They just sit in the ABM register, and the only thing you can do is cancel them and then use them for reporting to your shareholders, stakeholders, and governments.
Very interesting. That's very enlightening. Okay, we have a few minutes left. So for 1 minute each from each speaker, what do you expect this year from in terms of Article 6.8? Is there going to be any movement? Are you optimistic? Tell us. Steve, maybe we can start with you.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, as I said, I mean, I think that I think the initiative is a bit of a crossroads, and they do need to be thinking about whether or not they got it right first time around. Basically, frankly speaking, I mean, I think that there are some sort of major challenges there with accessing the platform and the technical requirements that are sort of sitting behind that. And so, I mean, I think there may be some discussion along these lines. At least I hope there is, because you know, I think that some of these challenges will come up in the submissions process, and they'll take that seriously. So it'll be interesting to see the extent to which there may be any preparedness or not to sort of revisit some of the approaches when it comes to accessibility to the platform in particular.
Okay, so maybe on that, Garrett, maybe you can say about, maybe I can see that you might have some feedback coming in for this year, no, about your experience.
Yes, yeah. Well, I'm just two things I wanted to say. The first is that look, despite the fact that we call it the adaptation benefits mechanism, it is really just a process for defining an activity that you want to do, with a transparent means of working out the financing gap, how much money do you need to pay to get that done, and then facilitating a transaction, a payment from a third party for that activity. And what that means is, although we've got adaptation in it, you can do a word search and replace adaptation with biodiversity, and you can replace adaptation with mitigation. And you can create, well, we're creating certified adaptation benefits, but you could create certified biodiversity benefits or certified mitigation benefits, all of which would be a means of wealthy countries transferring funds to developing countries to help pay for the costs associated with the impacts of climate change and fighting climate change. So one way is you could say, look, actually, we don't need to put any more mechanisms. Well, no, I can't say you don't need to put any more on, but we could broaden the scope of the ABM and make it generic. And actually, I think you could find that a huge number of activities that you wanted to do could then fit under that framework. Because you have in your methodology, you define your own benefit. We're not saying what an adaptation benefit is. Up to the project developer to say what that adaptation benefit is. The host country has to agree, because they say, yes, we accept that that is going to be a contribution to our needs, and you need to find a buyer who agrees with what it is that you're selling. So there's huge flexibility there. And slightly more practically, I hope that we can bring our first certified adaptation benefits to Brazil. We're working hard to try to produce some, but it would be really nice if we could get some and show them off in an event there. Thank you very much.
Thanks. And then Peter?
Sure. Thanks, Eliza. Well, there's a couple of pieces of the enabling environment for 6.8 that could be reviewed and completed. But let me say first that the Secretariat has been very cooperative, very easy to work with on this.
Yeah.
The Glasgow Committee's been great. So
Yeah.
this is really the constraints imposed by parties.
Yeah.
And that's what needs to be revisited. Let's revisit the two-party requirement to allow access to the platform for organizations of all types that support innovative finance. Something that countries can do at this moment is ensure that their NDCs include Article 6.8 activities and or address the conditional portion of their NDCs with respect to the potentials of 6.8. This year, we would like to see the Glasgow Committee aggressively advance an operational link to the Convention on Biological Diversity to better align NDCs and National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plan outcomes. This will manifest itself most powerfully with respect to food system interventions. And finally, we hope that with support of parties, which mostly means parties get out of the way, Glasgow Committee could welcome foundations, endowments, faith networks, community foundations, indigenous federations as potential partners. And really, this is the question. Do parties want to marginalize the 6.8 effort? The Glasgow Committee and the Secretariat, they don't want to see this marginalization. They want to see the platform move to the center of climate finance actions, and we should all be working to help with that effort. Thank you very much.
Great words from Peter. And now I turn it over to Aditi to close this webinar, which I think is just appropriate. Aditi.
Thank you. Thank you, Eliza, and thank you, Peter, Stefan, and Gareth, for absolutely spellbinding discussions. I personally learned a lot. And in an environment where we are seeing such stringent reduction in climate finance, every source of finance that can be gathered, particularly for the most vulnerable countries, is useful. And CGIAR is committed to work with all of you and with all and use our research to inform these policies and these processes. So thank you so much. Briefly, my name is Aditi Mukherjee. I lead the platform CGIAR Climate Impact Platform functions. And a part of the function is exactly to do this, to build in and bring in the best of the expertise that's out here to inform our own work, science work that we do at the CGIAR. So we are launching a new science program. It's called the Climate Action Science Program. And this was the first webinar of that Climate Action Science Program series. We would have, for all of you who are joining us online and are in this meeting right now, we would have 3 series of these webinars. The first one, of which we had the first episode today, and thank you, Eliza, so much, would be learning from COP29 on our journey to COP30. What is it that we can do to inform the COP30 processes so that the core of our constituency, which is our smallholder farmers, our smallholder producers, livestock, and fisherfolk, can benefit through these international processes. So we would run 5 of these webinars in this series. Some of the other processes that we would be looking at would be the Global Goals on Adaptation, NCQG. We would have one, today we had one on Article 6.8, but we would have another one on loss and damage and the Sharm el Sheikh agriculture track. So those would be the 5. In addition, please stay tuned for 2 more webinar series. One would be what's new in climate science. We would be in that inviting scientists from outside the CGIAR who do groundbreaking work on the climate science and policy. And that would be a way in which we incorporate their new work into and learn what we can do within the CG. And our third series, which we are also hoping to launch, would be basically insights from the CGIAR's own science. So basically anything that we do that we feel that the others can learn from it, we would also run a seminar series. So those would be our 3 seminar series going forward. This climate action science program will last till 2030. So, and we are really looking forward to engaging with all of you going forward. So thank you again. Join us for our next one, which will be in 2 weeks' time. There would be information out on the social media. And yes, and all this recording will be up on the YouTube as soon as it's over. So thank you again, and good luck for all the great work that you do. Bye.